Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see everybody here. My name is Helen Lee Warren, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the first Milken Institute Art Panel. Our topic today is investing in immortality, and our panel will be discussing art as an asset class, and also art and how it pertains to investing. And we're hoping to touch upon exciting trends in Asia, such as private museums and philanthropy. But before we begin, I want to just, before I introduce the panel, I want to just give a little bit of art historical context to our discussion and talk about the Medicis, who were a banking family and political dynasty in Florence, Italy, and who also wielded great cultural influence at the same time during the Renaissance. The Medici Bank was a highly prosperous and respected institution in Europe, and the Medicis were considered amongst the wealthiest on the continent. Could we have the first slide, please? From their seat of power, the Medicis created an environment in which art and humanism flourished. They, along with other banker merchant families, invested vast sums of money for art and architecture and were patrons of some of the greatest artists and architects of all time. Among them, and you can see on the screens, we have Donatello's David, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, and Leonardo Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. Not in the order that I've said it, but I think you can all figure it out which ones I'm referring to. Could we have the next slide, please? 5 centuries later, their legacies remain as great patrons of the art. Here is Leonardo's Salvator Mundi, the depiction of Christ as Savior of the world. It's the most expensive work of art ever sold at auction. Is that right, Ben?
Yep.
At Christie's, fetching $450 million last year. Moving forward to the present. Next slide, please. There's been an extraordinary growth in wealth since the global financial crisis, and wealth growth in this region has far surpassed that of the West. Since 2014, the number of high net worth individuals here in Asia has surpassed that in both Europe and North America. As a result, some ultra high net worth Asians have turned to art as an asset class and perhaps are aspiring for more. Here are some examples. Next slide. In 2014, Chinese collector Liu Yiqian successfully bid 281 million Hong Kong dollars, or 36 million US dollars, for a rare porcelain chicken cup from the Chenghua period. Here he's shown sipping tea out of the pricey little cup. Apparently, owning a piece of dynastic history links a buyer directly to the greatness of the past. Next to him, we have Maezawa's, can we go back? Next to the lovely chicken cup, we have the Maezawa Basquiat selfie. In May of 2017, Yusaku Maezawa, a billionaire Japanese art collector, acquired this Jean-Michel Basquiat work, Untitled, from 1992 for $110.5 million, the highest price ever for both a US artist and for a black artist. And here's a picture of him posing in front of it right after acquiring the work. This isn't his selfie picture, but he did post it on Instagram as a selfie. Maezawa is an avid collector of contemporary art and plans to build a museum in Chiba, east of Tokyo. So I'm now very pleased to introduce our exceptional group of panelists. They are all pioneers in their field, and also they come from very disparate areas of the art market. So I'm hoping that they're going to have a chance to explain why they've come into the positions or why they've discovered the exciting parts of the art world that they're presently in. I'm going to start to my right with Mr. Ben Clark, Deputy Chairman of Christie's Asia. Hi, Ben.
Hi there.
Christie's was the first international Western auction house to hold independent sales in mainland China. Very exciting. Ben is a seasoned auction house veteran who understands the art market and collectors' tastes and desires, especially in Asia. So Ben, how did you come to be in the auction world and find your way in Asia?
I started off as a student, actually as a frustrated architect, so I always have been interested in how things looked, and the art world was very much part of who I was. I then found myself as a postgrad working in a museum in Chicago, at the Art Institute of Chicago for 2 years, which is where I cut my teeth in learning about artworks and learned how to look at art. And it was from there that it blossomed, and I went back to London and worked at Christie's as a postgrad, and have done many different things at Christie's ever since, and most recently moved to Asia in the last 2 years.
What do you think sets the auction world apart from the rest of the art world?
I don't think it's set apart from the art world. I mean, as several of us were talking earlier, the art market is an ecosystem. It's a word that we all talk about. And like any marketplace, you need all component parts of that ecosystem for the market to flourish. And from my perspective, Christie's is just one segment of that ecosystem. So you obviously can start with, let's say, the artists, and then you have patrons, and then you have collectors, and they can all be slightly different and varying. And they're what I would classify as the enablers of the art market. They are the people that are, to use an ugly word, producing what we're all talking about. And then you have the slightly more commercial side, so advisors, gallerists like Pearl, auction houses, and then you have the education sector, which is museums, private or public. And then governments play a huge part in this. How a government decides in any given country to ensure that the art market is open to its population, or what they might invest in it, has a significant part to play again in that whole ecosystem.
So Elizabeth, you are the Senior Director of Art and Culture at the Ayala Museum and Foundation. And tell us a little bit about the Ayala and how long you've been there and what makes it a special place.
I think I've been with Ayala for about 5-6 years now, and what drew me to the place is really the ability to be able to make art and culture more accessible. So we are a nonprofit, and when you asked me about immortality, I said, well, maybe that's the aspect of this equation that will address how works of art become immortal. Because I think in institutions like museums, where they're there for generations, for people to appreciate, then maybe there is a chance to do that. And a lot of it really has got to do with making people want to come to see it. I come from a market where, museum going isn't top of mind. So we go through hoops to try and get people engaged with art and culture, because it speaks about themselves. And so that becomes the challenge now for this aspect of the ecosystem that I'm in.
It was established in 1967, which is relatively an early time for a heritage museum like yours to come to be such an important player.
Because the principals, who are the Ayala family, have always been supporters of art and culture. And so they were one of the first, if not the first, to establish a private museum. And it has since grown to include, among other things, a fabulous pre-colonial gold collection from the 10th to the 13th century, visual arts, indigenous textiles, and ceramics. So it is a bit encyclopedic, but we are by no means a national museum. The collection that defines this museum was started by the owners, and from there we have grown it over time.
So Dr Kataoka is the founder of Dr Kataoka Studios. You're Japanese-American, and you're a visual artist crossing traditional boundaries of art and technology. I know you've presented at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and you've also exhibited your art at the International Space Station. And you were a speaker yesterday at the Women's Summit here. So tell us a little bit about your practice. You're actually in California, in Silicon. Tell us about where you are and how you work and the way that your studio is.
So I am based in Silicon Valley, which I think is this incredible creative geyser. I mean, Silicon Valley is the Paris and New York of today without question, and it's an incredible place to be creating art. I've built a very successful art practice and a thriving business there, and my art collectors are technologists, entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and they are really interested in art that is really something that can stimulate their creativity and that can really make them think. And so, you know, I am the CEO of my own business. I'm running a business. You know, I'm responsible for all my employees. I have skilled artisans and computer programmers and 3D CAD designers all working for me. So at the end of the day, I have to make sure that we keep the lights on and keep everything going. But what separates me from a typical business person selling widgets is that at the end of the day, I'm an artist first and foremost, and my measuring stick is immortality, and that's one of the things I'm thinking about with respect to this panel. But in my work over the years, I have integrated a lot of technology, and I think that technology is really the heartbeat of our time. So I have done works with EEG, with brainwaves. I'm working a lot with virtual reality right now. I'm an artist in residence for Google VR Tilt Brush, and I'm part of Facebook Oculus Launchpad. And I'm doing a lot of different things that are at this really rich intersection of art, science, and technology.
And I want to talk to you more about how your business operation is out of the normal or everyday typical realm of the nexus of dealer, gallery, or even the way you exhibit. It's not the same way that other artists might exhibit their work. But we'll come back to that because definitely not least at all, but last we have Pearl Lam, the founder of and owner of Pearl Lam Galleries. Pearl, I think everybody knows you from your years of being a driving force within Asia's contemporary art scene, working with artists and collectors from around the world. You're a pioneering gallerist in more than one way, an iconoclast, one of the first women, and one of the first supporters of Western contemporary art in Asia. And you also have a foundation, which I didn't know about, which is very exciting because you're supporting contemporary Chinese art and culture that you've played a part in creating. Can you tell us a bit about why you've decided, at what age, or how you came about your idea to be such an important gallerist and support Western contemporary art in Asia?
Actually, when I came back, I was sent away to study when I was 11. And when I returned back to Hong Kong, I did not know what I want to do. But the only thing I know what I want is I don't want to have my family influence in any career that I want to build. So,
but tell us
so
how
by
old
default,
were you when you first decided that you were going to...
I love art. I love art. I love art. Art is a passion. But to turn a passion into a career, you need to be very fortunate to do that. So at the time when I returned back to Hong Kong, actually, Hong Kong, Asia, there's no art market, there's no art movement. Contemporary art is pretty, non-interesting, and there's nothing there. So anyway, of course my parents, being very Chinese parents, they said absolutely no over my dead body. So I was sent to China to do a property development. And lucky enough, because I was in China, I couldn't even speak a word of Mandarin. But because I was in China, I met Chinese artists. And then by default, I entered into the Chinese world. And I went to China with a very colonial attitude. Not unknowingly, I was really and adopting this colonial attitude. So after years listening to them, learning really about Chinese culture, then I realized the importance of Chinese culture. And that is one of the reasons why I started that and that foundation. But and while I was doing that, I was also doing pop-up shows in Hong Kong. This was one of my negotiations with my father. And I started this pop-up show in 1993. Yeah. The reason why I choose to be a gallery rather than doing a museum and foundation, because beside I have a passion in art is I love to grow a career of an artist, not just to build a market, but you have to build credentials. So I have to place artworks in museums, and at the same time, I have to build the market. Without building the market, auction house wouldn't even look at us because they would only look at artists who has a certain market. And of course, we as a gallerist and auction house, we are enemies. We are supposedly enemies.
I think that's wrong.
I know, because artists doesn't want us to have any works in the auction house. It was one of the things, one of many artists said, if our work, if you don't protect our works is an auction house, we are out. We won't have any relationship. I mean, there's different ways of working. I mean, Asia, Western is always different. But at the time, it was much more simple than now. And so I wanted to get involved in the art world. I love talking to artists. Because of the artists, I learned to become a Chinese. Because being abroad for so many years and being a Hong Kongese, I didn't understand Chinese culture.
So it sounds like you were, from a very young age, determined to make your way into
an
art person.
Because I really love art, but I didn't know what to do with it.
And you found your way as a gallerist.
And I found my way as a gallerist. And I also, because my relationship with all the artists, I realized that what I would love is to make known of these artists in the West, I mean, in
building
the international world, and
artists.
also Chinese art,
yes.
The movement.
Exactly. So I want to ask all of you to start the ball rolling. We can see we have sort of disparate perspectives on the art market and the art world in general. So what does it take these days if you're a high net worth individual, or not yet quite a high net worth individual, to start a collection or make an impact in the current art market?
I just want to build on what Pearl was saying. I think it really starts with the artist, knowing the artist.
Yes.
You don't just buy something and you don't understand what was behind it. I think knowing, and I'm sure Drew must feel that too, that it really all starts with knowing the artist. And some of the biggest collectors that I've heard about make their selection based on
so Elizabeth,
that's absolutely true.
How do you
I think this is a museum world talking, okay? Okay, I know.
Yeah.
I call speculators, collectors, and shopaholics, all right? You have to differentiate. There are many investors and speculators. They would just buy the art and put it in a crate. They never even see it.
Correct.
They sat there because there are people always asking me, hey, Pearl, you know, I want to buy a Chinese, an art. I know that in the 2007, I mean, that era, that decade, some of the artworks went up 100 times. How am I going to do it? I said, you have to sit there, sit on your piece of art for 10, 30 years. You will definitely get it if you buy A grade. Grade A paintings, certain. But I literally know people who really doesn't even know art, doesn't love art, but they buy just for investment. It was in a crate for years,
Pearl,
never seen.
Going back to the question though, so let's say that you are a wannabe collector, a beginning collector, or an advanced collector. What are the ways to meet artists or to learn about?
First of all, I would talk to the person who wants to buy art. Whether you are really a collector or whether you are speculators, we don't sell to speculators.
What's the difference between a collector and a speculator?
We don't like people coming into us and buying art and flip the art.
So the reason the Pearl will have that
yes, exactly.
understandably is because she's looking to protect the artist.
Yeah, we have to protect the art.
As a contemporary art gallery, you of course protect the artist who, you don't want that artist's, the culture of the artist to be degraded.
Sure, you want to control the market.
And it can't be a short-term thing, it has to be a long-term thing, and so you're protecting that market. If you're not collecting contemporary art,
exactly.
which is then, there are many other different ways of doing it, whether it's auction or through advisors or dealers, and that's the difference we see in Asia, is that this year at Christie's, 60% of the Asian spend, 60% of the Asian spend within Christie's globally has been in non-Asian art, contemporary or otherwise.
Absolutely.
And actually, when most Asian collectors start off at Christie's, they come in with Western blue chip artists because they feel confident about the classic tenets of when you start collecting quality, the history of the provenance of the work of art, the authenticity, and these things are well documented for, let's say, blue chip impressionisms or Picasso, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas the contemporary artist, there's a whole lot more education that needs to go on. And you need the gallerist or the artist themselves to educate. But when the artist is dead,
Yeah.
That's a lot more complicated.
No, but when the artist is dead, it's also a problem, because if the artist is dead, you don't have a foundation to keep on promoting that. Then they will be forgotten. How many artists has been forgotten? And all of a sudden, like Motherwell. Robert Motherwell was a really great American school artist. And then when he died, because of the foundation fighting, he was forgotten. And then it was the galleries again remarketing, re-putting them in the whole market, and then the price started going up again.
Yeah, no, it is. But I mean, if you turn this, when I saw the title of Immortality, which slightly freaked me out. Yeah, it's slightly godly. It's like a god complex. Actually, I think it's about mortality. I think people collect because they want to be mortal, and they might have a glimpse at immortality.
Absolutely.
It's the artists that become immortal by virtue of the art they create, and that depends on whether they can remain in.
But not necessarily just the artists, because if you
or
look
the
at
artwork.
if you look at King Tutankhamun, which is one of the most like the funerary works, it's one of the most immortal works of all time. We don't really remember the artists. But they did such a great job that we certainly remember King Tutankhamun, and he wasn't even one of the greatest pharaohs. But the artwork is so great that we remember him.
But you remember the visualization. So, for example, the Medicis, the only reason they were, when you talk about a Medici collector in general now, we refer to collectors who buy big-ticket items, but they also buy across categories, so not just contemporary art. They will also, so the Medicis themselves.
Medici is a great patron.
They were patrons of then contemporary artists, but they were also collectors of, they looked to the past. They were collectors of Byzantine mosaics and gold coins from ancient Greece.
Well, Ben, let's go back to the statistic you were giving us from Christie's. So 60% of Christie's clients are now collecting contemporary art.
No, 60% of the Asian spend at Christie's.
So it's the value of the total
is non-Asian
auction results are.
It could be old masters, Western old masters, it could be anything else.
So the entire market in Asia apparently has grown from $108 million to $210 million over the past 5 years.
So yeah, to put it another way, in 2008, so 10 years ago, it represented, I think, 12% of our annual sales, and last year, 2017, it was 32%.
So what is the reason, do you think, behind the growth of the contemporary market here in Asia, given what you're saying that?
I don't think there is a growth of the contemporary market. I think
not
it is growing,
Yes.
but it's a growth of collecting and a growth of passion about art and looking to the past, the present, with an eye to the future. So if the Medicis looked at the past and the present with a nod to the future, I think the same thing is happening with collectors in Asia. They are looking to the past. And, there's also, we were at a time, listening to other panelists today, where a very transitional moment in mainland China in particular, where second-generation wealth is coming about. So first-generation collectors in Asia often collected Chinese works of art, classical ink paintings, as you'd expect.
Well, that market is apparently growing as well.
That market is maintaining. It's not as growing as fast as...
No, not nearly as fast,
but it's still there. But the children are often go straight, because they've been educated abroad.
The children are all buying Western art, and they're all buying household name art, and especially, which is quite shocking, is they are only late 20s, early 30s with a budget of like $2 million US per work.
Yeah.
Well, this is how they're buying.
This is
it's so shocking. They're only buying Western big names without knowing about really knowing about that.
Well, is this a good idea? Is this something that should be looked at in a positive way?
I don't think there's a good idea or bad idea. It's the evolution of an economy, and hopefully that after they buy all these and they start collecting it, they become interested and turn to be a better collector. That's what, for me, I've been through my era when people has completely not interested in art, and to now that everybody, when we sit on a dinner table, they talk about art. And if anybody wants to collect anything for whatever reason, is a good start.
Well, let's talk about trends, though. I understand what you're saying, that there's a younger generation who is eager to get in the market and to learn about artists, but are there any trends to keep an eye out for, certain types of artwork or names or?
Now it's a social life. So if one person said that they are buying one artist, there's a gang that they will follow and buying the same artist.
Of something that's happening today, or of a style or an artist.
I mean, Impressionism is that blue chip art that everyone dives into.
I think Impressionism is the older generation. I mean, it's the older generation. I know all these late 20s, early 30s, they were buying Kondo, they were buying Jonah Woods. I mean, they were just...
But they still buy Post-Impressionism and Picasso as well.
Oh, yes, of course. But I thought those are, I mean, what I see is those are much older generation, not the late 20s, early 30s.
I have differing opinions.
Yeah.
Everybody can have a different opinion about that.
But I think what's interesting, though, and I agree with Pearl, that the dynamism of the art world here in Asia, even if it's not all for the right reason yet, I think is...
Yeah,
I mean, God,
but I hope that
a major hurdle.
I mean, it's a good. I mean, it's a start for them to change.
And I think over time, ideally, if they get serious, then they will become more informed because there's so much information available now. You don't have to really get a degree. You can read a little bit more.
To Pearl's earlier point, and what you were just saying, I don't see while this younger generation is spending a lot of money on single works of art, I don't see them making bad decisions. So it's not like when in the mid-2000s when some parts of Europe were buying art rashly for high prices, inflated prices, for a period of 3 or 4 years, and then they just stopped.
You think it's a somber...
This is, from what I've witnessed,
this is
much
educated
more,
market.
Much more educated, much more intelligent. They're informed decisions. They're not overspending. They're not inflating a market.
There are no bubbles on specific...
No, I think that they passed the era because in the 2000s, what I know of, I've seen people buying all these big names like Dali, Rodin, and all that, and they don't even know what is a live cast or what is a performance cast, or they don't even have authentication certificate.
So we've moved on from
that.
I
think it's
but we're still not getting any specific answers about artists or trends that are going to be helpful.
If I knew, I'd be buying it myself.
I can tell you about artists.
Exactly.
Maybe
so
Drew, you can...
Drew.
Let's take a moment, because I find what you're doing and your practice very, very exciting. Mm-hmm. You're not only on the cutting edge of the type of art that you produce, but the way you operate is also very interesting as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I love the topic of this panel because in terms of the Medicis, I mean, there were many people who were great bankers, but we really do remember the Medicis because they nurtured and enabled and brought into the world this great art. And you said, Ben, you were saying that they look to the past and they give a nod to the future. I would say that it's more than a nod because the type of artists that they empowered were on the cutting edge, and Michelangelo and Leonardo, they were pushing the boundaries. And so they were like a state of the art of the art. So for me, actually, my model is quite different. And in Silicon Valley, it's funny because you see all of this press that comes out like, oh, the Silicon Valley elite is not buying art. And actually, that is not true. They're not buying art from galleries there, so the galleries are really struggling, but they're buying a lot of directly commissioned art. And so that is what I do. 2/3 of the work that I do is directly, privately commissioned. And so when, Elizabeth, you were talking about this relationship with the artist, it's so important. It's so powerful because if you commission a work of art, it's an on-demand, created just for you piece, which means if you commissioned it, you're responsible for bringing it into the world. So that's really, really very exciting.
Very closely aligned to the patron.
I mean, the idea of a gallery actually, we forget, because most of the art world is galleries, that it's actually a relatively recent phenomenon. It's only like in the past 100 years that we have had art galleries, but the gallery is really something that was a model perfected in the United States and took a lot of inspiration from retail boutiques. It's essentially retail, and as such, it has some different characteristics, such as standardization. To sell something very, very unique is very, very difficult in a retail context, and branding. You know, a Prada bag should look like a Prada bag a mile away. A Rothko should look like a Rothko from space. But the problem is that some of these retail-born characteristics are in direct conflict with immortal art. Because, like, if you look, for example, your first slide, the Sistine Chapel, if you look at the Sistine Chapel, that was really an experiment in fresco painting for Michelangelo, who is the king of marbles. It was a total experiment. And if he had if Michelangelo had had a gallerist at the time, his gallerist would probably have told him to stick to his marbles and not go out and branch out so much. So I think that you know, the commission model is tremendously interesting, and I say it's a little bit like the movie Back to the Future, right? Back to the Future. We're going back to this old model that we had with the Medicis, which in the history of art, all the greatest masterpieces that we've ever had, most all of them have been this direct commission model. And it's working incredibly well in Silicon Valley.
In the history of Western art, yes, because effectively the canons of Western art have been dictated, and the framework and the context, dictated entirely by the church and by the real patrons of art in the West have always been
aristocrat and the church.
It's not the same in, you know, you look at Edo period Japan, where the greatest works of art are ceramics or the screens from the, you know, I suppose you'd call it the 16th century, are indeed commissioned then by the monarchs.
Yes.
Or the
imperial.
And it's always about leaders. And so yes, it's good. But I think, you know, to your point, what you're doing with this as a studio, and it tends to be sculptors, interestingly, when I look at Gormley, yourself, Joanna Vasconcelos.
Actually, you can pull up slide number 7, speaking of sculpture.
Okay, then, you know, and you look at Joanna Vasconcelos, you all, by virtue of what you're creating, need a big team, and it's an artist studio creating all of this.
Because commissioning, I mean, if you do commissioning, you work with your owner or work with the person who commissioned you to build the piece together. It's like in architecture. You need to have that link. But many of these, when we do commission pieces, they are either through an art consultant as well. Many of these in the general world is art consultant. I don't know about Silicon Valley, but when, you know, when we look at these, a lot of these land art, a lot of these, if it is not the galleries going in, it will be an art consultant going in, linking the artist to work with a developer or work with the owner. But many of these owners or people who commission doesn't have this art talk. They are not interested. They're only interested with a piece of work. So at the end, you will be talking to a curator, creating the piece of work.
But that's a lot of middlemen, and that's really a problem. I think one of the things that's really exciting about, like, the commission model is in like e-commerce terms, it's DTC, or direct to consumer. So the amount of overhead that I cut out is incredible, and I can pass that value on to the customer.
But you are presuming that the consumer knows about art. But many of the consumer or many of the collectors that I know, they don't know art, and also they don't have the confidence to talk to the artists to make this dialogue.
You're absolutely right.
So therefore, they will always have a curator, or the galleries will come in and try to translate.
So this is interesting. So this is like a really big contrast, and is that this idea of the lack of confidence, that's something that I see a lot more, like with more like New York people. Like, they're always like, oh, is this the right thing? Like, is this the right status symbol that I'm supposed to have on my wall? And like the Silicon Valley tycoons, like, I mean, these are people who are like pretty much changing the face of artificial intelligence. They kind of have confidence in what they think is going to stimulate their creativity, is going to inspire them, and they just have a really, like, they have incredible gut instincts, and they really kind of don't really go for all of the art mumbo jumbo, but they're incredibly smart. They have incredible aesthetics. We have some of the best art collectors in the world, and they're also really exciting to work with, like what you're talking about, that personal link.
But I think Silicon Valley must be very different, because whole of America, when I go to America, what shocked me is everyone has an art advisor. Every single.
Well, I think that's a subject unto itself. But
I mean, Silicon Valley is really different
and making sure that people feel comfortable with knowing about their artwork. And I wanted to ask Elizabeth about your role as a museum director and what you do in educating the public and making sure you get as many people, audience.
So I think that is probably half or 3/4 of what we do, is really to find ways to make, as I mentioned earlier, art accessible. Now, that's either you do lectures, you workshops, you allow the interface with the artist to happen. And in a sense, that has sort of shaken also the traditional role of museums. It used to be, it used to be like it was a place of worship for secular art.
Yes.
It's like, people go there and
an alternate church,
an alternate church,
worship.
and they worship. No, now the challenge is for museums to mine what they have and be able to create meaning with these collections so that it connects with today and what the issues are. We work with many people, other curators, artists like Drew, to be able to make that happen. And also to allow the regular man on the street to believe that there's something new all the time that's coming in. The problem is if when you have a collection, people will just say, oh, I've seen it, and they'll never come back.
And you do a lot of cross-cultural and
yes,
museum loans to other museums.
A lot of that is also important because you need to have relationships with museums across the world, because then we exchange. And because of the exchange, then we know a little bit more about each other's culture. So that is a whole dynamic that I think has changed for museums. And I think it happened about 20 years ago when somebody said, it's no longer about something, it's being for someone. So that sort of let museum practitioners step out of a cloud and begin to think of how to do this. So museum development is really quite an exciting space. We work, again, within an ecosystem. So I do work with auction houses, I work with galleries, I work with artists to make that happen. So it's not a sleepy place, and it's not a quiet church
Well,
anymore.
I know you've expanded now into the visual arts as well as just heritage and culture.
Right.
So tell us about experiences with working with direct artists. Do you have Philippine artists?
Well, there are.
highlighting?
What we do is we work with Filipino artists, and we do give them an opportunity to show in the museum. Generally, they are mid-career artists. We have another gallery for emerging artists, but I think what that does is it allows the general population to see more of their work. Because what we notice is, and it's true, some of the best works are in the possession of collectors, but nobody sees it. I mean, I have worked with collectors who have allowed me to showcase their collections at the museum, and they are absolutely thrilled when young students come up to them and say, thank you. We would have never seen this if you hadn't loaned it to us, to this museum. So in that sense, this immortality business takes shape. Many of my friends who are collectors suddenly realized, whereas before they would be afraid to share their collection, I said, you don't have to build a museum if you're not yet ready, but you can share it.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the idea of immortality and building museums, because apparently statistics show that it's becoming a very popular and big trend.
In China, I think private museums are off the roof, right?
They've more than doubled from 1,500
I think
to
the exponential growth.
3,000.
But if you look at private museums in the West that were created during, if we look at Britain in particular, which I know particularly well, during the sort of the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century, when Britain had a bit of cash, and people were doing exactly the same thing, and there are hundreds of private museums. If you look at them 100 years later, they're all either government-owned, closed, the collections have been dispersed. Right. The longevity stroke immortality of private museums is so much more complicated than just buying art and putting it in a museum. It does, the sustainability of a museum requires an audience.
Right.
And unless you have an audience which dictates...
And also a budget for exhibition program preservation.
And you need audiences.
And generally speaking, when it comes to private museums, then the principals have to be committed. I mean, they originally probably built these museums to house their collections, but I noticed that as they become more enlightened, then they realize that there is much more benefit to keeping it interesting for private museums that are owned by big tycoons, for example. They realize it gives you some kind of soft power if you use the art also in another fashion.
Which is why I think it's more of a mortal quest.
Yeah. Mortal quest, it's true.
So I wanted to just correct myself and go back to something that Ben said. Apparently in 2006, there were only 1,500 museums in Asia, and now that there are over 4,000, and growing. And in addition, there are very interesting institutions that have come across in a very global, international way. I know we've spoken about M+, and Booty Tech's Hughes Museum in Shanghai has just made a collaborative partnership with LACMA. It is a difficult operation to have a museum.
You have to have very energetic young people.
Very expensive as well.
Very expensive.
Very expensive.
And it's highly creative, I must say. I mean, many people suddenly realize that you need really people who can think fresh ideas.
Well, I think one of the biggest problems that museums are grappling with is, again, adopting technology.
Right.
And they're not harnessing technology to its full power. You always have this problem with collections that you're always ever showing the tip of the iceberg. And I think what we will see with the full realization of virtual reality is that you will be able to compress huge artworks and give fully immersive experiences and transport them all over and be able to give more surface area to your collection. But in order to be able to do that, we need to be able to train people at the beginning of the pipeline who are going into the art world, whether they are artists or people who are wanting to go into art on the institutional side, to be more tech savvy. So, you know, artists and institutional people in the institutional art world need to integrate more with that early on.
You know what I found interesting, Drew, is like at our museum, we're a small museum, but we've adopted VR in one of our historical exhibitions. And the moment we put it out there, the texture of the audience that came through the museum, the youth just came in with no problem because the interface was something they understood.
It's more native.
And so it was really very interesting to watch, and now we're expanding,
But again, the limitations of that are that there's a finite number of youth in any given place, city, location, geography. Surely the advantages of technology in looking at art is to, as you say, and I know nothing about this, but I once met a Google guy that showed me something. They have pixelated something, so the Sistine Chapel, apparently Google have now photographed it to the nth degree, to such a degree that
megapixels,
you can zoom into like that much and see it on your computer screen and see it exactly.
Absolutely.
And it's the question of how you digitalize and promote and allow a global audience to see these things that otherwise would have been impossible to see.
No, it's an incredible thing. You're exactly right. And the thing with the Google Cultural Institute.
What's it called? Is Google Cultural?
Yeah, Google Cultural Institute, which is amazing. And I know some of the people there, is that interestingly, you can make the argument that in some cases it's better to look at something on Google Cultural Institute than to see it in person. Like the Mona Lisa,
and
there's 500 people in front of you, you run by, or the Sistine Chapel, you know,
it's a bit far.
You can't see that close, right? There is.
Well, there is a great experience. You can go in the morning and lie on the floor and look up, and that's worth doing it. Definitely do it if you can do it.
But talking about, you know, when you mention about the private museum in China and all that, but we have to distinguish whether a museum with a collection or is this a Kunsthalle, which is just no collection, just exhibition.
For our audience, could you explain to me and everybody else what you mean by the difference between a museum, of a private museum?
Okay, private, I mean,
that's a great
how
point.
China started with the private museum. It was in 2000 when China when China was nominated to be to have the Olympics held in China in 2008. They found out that there's not enough cultural destination. So China's government,
about Beijing 2008, with Saigo Chang.
I'm talking about 2000. So China government award anybody who can open museums that will create cultural destination. So all of a sudden, all these property developer went in and applied for museum in the name of museum. So when 2008 happens, many of the museums, so-called museum, has no collection, has no exhibition program, just a museum name, inverted commas. All right. So with that happening, then Chinese government get more anxious and more concerned. So now it is better, but still there are museums just with a name, maybe 2 paintings or 1 exhibition in 3 years. So there are many of these so-called museums that doesn't perform as a museum. Now, there is a museum with a collection, there's a museum as a Kunsthalle. Kunsthalle meaning that it is a space, and it is a space for exhibitions. So each of these museums would have a very strong, supposedly, an exhibition program that will fill up the year of, the whole year of exhibition. Then you have museum with collections. So you can have your own collection, which is showing, but just showing a collection is meaningless without a curatorial direction. So most of these museums, like yours, would choose different artworks and give curatorial directions to enhance the understanding of the art movement.
Right.
So when we're looking towards the future and looking for artists who will theoretically last the test of time, what are some aspects that we should look for in terms of how they're shown and how they work and what their mode of operation is in terms of whether they want to be in museums or whether they have a secondary market? Is there some sort of guideline that
I think you have to have all the above, as we've all touched on this ecosystem. It's a symbiotic relationship between artists, if they're still alive. The artwork is actually integral to all of this. The gallerist, the agent, the curator, the auction house, because you need a primary and a secondary market to survive. That's just a fact. You can belong in someone's wall as an artwork, and then you get,
it can be a
then
decoration.
you get passed down through generations, and by the second or third generation, everyone's forgotten what it is, and you've lost the meaning, unless there's a proper educational heritage that the family are passing on. And so things can get lost very quickly. So you need to ensure that an artist or an artwork is published or is exhibited in a meaningful museum, because then
so all of the above,
all of the above,
yes.
Every single, and where you see countries in Asia, as I've started to tour, the countries that don't have the full ecosystem are the ones that don't have a burgeoning art market. And don't ask me which ones.
Okay.
I'm not going to put that on public record.
But let me turn the question around. Where is there a burgeoning ecosystem, and where's the direction of where they're going?
In Asia, currently, nowhere as rich as, say, in the West. In certain
of course.
You've had 600 years, that's obvious. But, Hong Kong is getting at it very fast.
Korea is very good.
So, yes, Seoul is
Seoul, Taiwan.
Taipei has good museums and artists and galleries and auction houses. You need all of those, all of the above.
That's right.
So Elizabeth, where you are in the Philippines, and in terms of trying to grow your museum, which I know that we've spoken about that you were trying to do, how do you reach out to artists and the public to bring more attention to your museum?
As I said, well, we use technology in our own way. Drew, I said we've used virtual reality. We have our own app. We're not afraid.
Ben has used virtual reality.
Right.
Yeah,
and we're not afraid
use
to
it as
take
a marketing
photographs. Yeah. I mean, this thing about even taking photographs and sharing it online
VR is
a
our
major
next
issue
step.
for many museums.
It's obvious. It's the next step.
Yes, it's
We have to be all prepared for it.
No, virtual reality is going to change the way
Of
we
course.
work, play, sleep, govern, everything.
Of
And
course,
so as such, it's the future of art as
the
well.
art world, we are all prepared to take the next step, because, the digital has changed the way that how you sell art as well. So the next thing is visiting museum in VR is the next step. Of course it is.
Which might actually close, the contrary thing about that is it may well stop real visitors.
Right. No, but I think what happens
That
is
will be really
difficult
difficult for museums.
Our
who
theory
needs to
is
have that.
it allows you to
Visitors.
go beyond the walls of your museum, but that's what you want. You want more people to see the
museum
art.
without walls. Yeah.
No, but
the museum becomes a repository.
But now museum needs money, so they need ticketing. So they always want audience, visitors, international.
It's the same discussion as books and Kindle, and it's like it evolves. Like books for some people are now, you buy a hard copy because you want a souvenir, but you will read out of your Kindle.
Yeah,
so I'm exactly that way. So I think, but it hasn't killed the book for me, or
But the book industry, the publishing industry is nearly finished. It's really sad.
Pearl, turning the question that we're sort of looking at museums to you,
Yeah.
in terms of the bricks and mortars, how do you feel about the sort of mid-range or the younger galleries having a high level of closure or difficulty in operating because of this increase in VR or digital and buying things online?
Actually, we are not doing.
And not
you know what? When you say that it's difficult for the medium galleries and as such is the market as of today. The market is not a great market for mid-sized galleries.
You're saying despite the high prices and the statistics.
No,
the growth
because
of the
people
market
want to buy household names because the financial market is unstable. When it is unstable, collectors want to buy big names, younger artists.
Sure.
A younger household name doesn't even need to be blue chip as such, household names. So nearly all younger artists are completely strike out. Okay, the mid-career artist is having a hard time as well. But this is a phase that one goes through. But with the digital, actually it's helping you to sell art because there's so many websites selling art. I think online with Christie's, they're all selling. So that is a helpful tools because it's not direct because we're not talking about blockchain.
So you don't,
not yet, direct.
Not yet. But so you're saying that it's a complementary way.
It is a complementary way, but is it because now galleries use social media to promote artists, and you have digital sales on a certain level price range of art.
Are any of your artworks on digital or on online sales?
I've been selling artwork through JPEG since early 2000.
Right, but that's directly to your clients.
And then also, of course, nowadays everybody is in Artsy, is in all these different websites.
So you believe in them, you support
we
them
do that as well, but we don't do with every single artist. We do with some artists which is not of a high price.
But Helen, you're asking her about bricks and clicks and bricks and mortar, and Michael Milken showed a fantastic slide this morning in the Global Capital Markets session, and it showed that from 2006 to 2018, all of these big retailers, excepting out Walmart, their market cap dropped by 50%.
Of course.
So, like, you know, retail is struggling. Talk about trends. That's a huge trend, and that just inevitably bubbles down to the art world. And that's why I believe that the
art world is actually
model is actually incredibly strong and is going to be. I mean, Silicon Valley is just such an amazing place when you want to look at the future of any industry. I mean, time and time again, it's shown that, you know, things happen there first, and other regions follow. So I really think, I believe it's the future.
The circle of this.
But,
I understand.
but actually,
I was at that panel too.
But actually, art world, the art market grows until 2013, 2014, right?
Yeah,
it was expanded in such an incredible way.
That there's enough room for everything. For the brick and mortar galleries like yours.
Yes, I mean all the small. That's why all the small galleries became popping up after 2012. Everything, because 2006, 2008, 2009, a lot of small galleries closed down. But by 2013, small galleries start coming up again.
Okay, so I'm still not satisfied about trying to get hardcore answers from any of you. In the last 10 minutes,
10 minutes.
What Mike Milken called a speed round. Yeah. So I wanted to ask each one of you, what is your favorite artist or show that you've seen recently? It can be anywhere in the world. Just what's stuck in your mind, or what are you thinking about these days in terms of an artist's work or a particular exhibition?
To say a favorite show or favorite artist is too difficult to come up
just
with
recently, something you've seen.
One thing that strikes me that Christie's is doing at the moment, we're selling an artwork in the middle of October, a print that is touching on points we were talking about earlier, which is generated by AI. So VR for me is all about marketing experience and all that. We're now selling a painting that is completely generated from an algorithm. And it's by a collective group of people called, I think they call themselves Obvious. They're Paris-based, and it's about 4 or 5 individuals. They wrote an algorithm. They fed in 16,000 images of portraits, which were painted from the 15th century to the current day. And they generated this image. And and we're selling that at auction. It's the first time anything like that's ever come onto the open market, certainly.
Is that considered a secondary market?
Well,
AI?
so this is where there are slight disagreements on the panel. We sell primary artists at auction, but we sell them for a price point that is below what a gallery may otherwise sell them for. So this is going on the market at $7,000 to $10,000 US.
Estimate.
Estimate, might make more. The signature is the algorithm in sort of script, because that is what the computer decided to do.
Is this the first time
It's the first time it's ever happened. So if I think about technology and how it might disrupt the art world, not necessarily the commercial side, I think that will become a more exciting thing. I still don't know.
So Ben, this is something that you are very excited about.
I think it's highly unusual. Never heard of it before. They're challenging the whole idea of aesthetics and can computers generate cultural endeavors.
Fantastic.
So I think that's a fairly phenomenal.
Something that we should
look forward to.
keep an eye on for the upcoming sale. When is it? In October?
Mid-October, October the 20th.
So Elizabeth, same question for you. An exhibition, show, or a piece, a specific artwork that sticks in your mind that you've seen recently?
Yeah, I think the one that's stuck to my mind, and it's been since I saw it in Art Basel, the group called Team Lab.
Yes, I love Team Lab. Yes,
they're Japanese.
We all love Team Lab.
But I'm not talking because of the technology. It was more the emotional experience that I encountered, and it was through what I would have expected to be a cold medium, which is, it was...
Could you explain what that is for our audience?
Yeah, what happened was they did, it was a video presentation of sorts of flowers and leaves, and it was a lush depiction of a beautiful space of, just flora and fauna. And somehow, when you got closer to it, it all wilted. And it just tells you, and of course it's all about ecology and how man has sort of destroyed his environment. But it was a very emotional experience, and it was through a medium that I didn't expect
to be emotional.
Yeah,
very
that
interactive.
from. And so it was that stuck, and I've been following their careers and their developments, and I think they just built a new museum just for their
and
work.
they're now on the secondary market. They sell
right? Yeah, it's really an amazing experience, and then you say,
Are they selling in secondary market now?
now I know
the other day.
that there's potential in other.
How about you? What have you been thinking
Well,
about?
I was in Rome a couple months ago and saw the Pietà, which always brings me to tears. And I said this yesterday, but I am absolutely confident that if Michelangelo was alive today, he would be working in virtual reality. I mean, can you imagine the Sistine Chapel, the ceiling, the creation scene in virtual reality, or the Last Judgment, the souls ascending into heaven or being tortured and descending into hell? Imagine that in virtual reality. Leonardo Da Vinci most certainly would be working in artificial intelligence. I mean, he was legendary for these incredible to-do lists, which were things like, today I'd like to take the measurements of the sun, I'd like to go talk about non-Euclidean geometry with a mathematician friend of mine, I want to go inflate the lung of a pig and see which part of it inflates, and my personal favorite, which is, I want to go every Saturday to the hot baths to go view naked men, observe the naked men, right? So this kind of intellectual curiosity is just so amazing when we look at those artists from the Renaissance. But I mean, as an artist, your measuring stick is immortality. These great artists, Michelangelo and the Leonardos and the Picassos. But I think one of the things that's really a fascinating question is that if we go back to, let's say, the time of the artists who were creating the funerary works for King Tutankhamun. They were hoping to create something that would last 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years, 4,000 years, that would last forever and that would be something that would be significant for gods and humans. But today, when we ask ourselves, how do we create something that will truly be immortal? We have a much more difficult question. I mean, a much more difficult question, because in 3,000 years, we will most definitely have general artificial intelligence. So if we want to create something immortal, we have to make something that is not going to only appeal to humans. It's going to have to appeal to artificial intelligence, because we will have reached AI consciousness by that point. So that's something to wrap your head around.
Think about, yeah. Pearl,
top that.
sending the question.
I can't top that. This is
going
amazing.
back to
Oh, recently, I think one of the exhibition which enlightened me was the exhibition I went about Monet and abstract expressionism. I never realized that the later part, his later period of Monet has inspired the American abstract expressionism in the 1950s. So I was completely gaga over that.
And he was inspired by Japanese
artists. Yes, exactly.
Right?
Japanese artists, absolutely.
So much, Giverny.
And then you realize that when you see the little stroke and the gesture, and then you realize that then you think about all those Jackson Pollock, Rothko, then it seems that the dots are connected.
Absolutely.
So for me, this is the most enlightening thing, because I would have never think that a Monet and an abstract expressionist.
And actually, the history of the influence of Asian art on Western art is such a subterranean thing. It's so hidden.
And it was really amazing. I mean, for me, I just, before I went to that exhibition, I was in a Zhao Wuqi exhibition. So I saw this Asian, and then an impressionism, and then an abstract. So I thought all these dots for me is,
But that's
I was
a lot
very
of
excited.
wonderful things for us to think about and possibly go visit and look at. Before I ask if there are any questions, I just wanted to throw out this idea that there are a lot more opportunities and players and a multitude of ways to try to achieve immortality through art these days. There's a lot to see, a lot to learn. Collectors interested in building a legacy have a chance for investing in immortality in a multitude of ways compared to the Medicis of the Renaissance. Before we end the panel, does anybody have any questions for our esteemed speakers? No?
Come on, questions.
Everybody's going to go and look at all these wonderful shows and go visit Ben at Christie's to bid on his AI piece. So I'd just like to thank you all.
There's someone there.
Yes.
Oh.
I have a quick question. And it's to do with technology. I recall last year there was a panel discussing blockchain technology and art. And I'm wondering the panel's view on that with regards to technology and will that change the art world at all?
I think that's a great question. I'm not prepared to answer that. Ben?
If there's blockchain,
it's something that
we will be
certainly
deleted.
Christie's is very much taking it very seriously and looking at it. We held an art and tech summit at Christie's London with international speakers about 3 months ago, in which this was a hotly debated topic. I think the only thing with certainty that we predict is that blockchain is a ledger-based system, and therefore where in the art market ledgers are important, so recording, ownership, authenticity, price, etc. Without a doubt, something will happen. The limitations with that, though, are that so much of what we'll talk about are the historical artworks that people are buying, owning, etc. And to backdate or load up that level of information onto any kind of ledger system would just be a gigantic task. I remember when ArtNet started, they were the first online company to publicly publish online the global auction records, which is a sort of standard best practice. When they launched in about 2000, 2001, they only did records that went back to 1995. And it's never really gone any further back. So I think the same limitations will happen with blockchain if that's what it's used for. I'm sure artists I'm sure someone like Drew would have a better idea about artists creating something in blockchain that can then be immortalized. But
I think there's some investors who have already tried to create funds through blockchain.
They have, and there are auction houses, new startup auction houses.
I think in China there's a lot of people want to invest in art blockchain as well.
Yeah,
I don't see how it works, because you're right. I think the blockchain is really good in authentication, but then there are so many artworks in the world, and especially from old master, and China has been thousands of years. How are we going to, and even today, even when you authenticate some of the old artworks, it's impossible.
But it's a very interesting concept. and really something that people are keeping an eye on, because it feels like intuitively there might be some possibility there with crypto.
I think
I'll just say that it is interesting for provenance, and I think
Yeah.
that it also will go really hand in hand with virtual reality works in terms of authenticating these.
So that's definitely a trend that we've talked about. I just wanted to say this, we could just go on for hours, I feel.
Yes.
Yeah, we could go on for hours, but we have to unfortunately end it here. So I want to thank you all for coming, Ben, Elizabeth, Drew, Pearl, for
Thank
making
you.
such a dynamic and passionate argument about what you do and your roles and how the whole art world works together collaboratively. I also want to thank the entire Milken Institute team for adding this new art and culture initiative to their insightful and extraordinary programming at the conference. And thank you all for joining. I hope you had a good time. My name is Helen Lee Warren, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.